The call that shouldn't exist. Smash the like button like you're trying to break the evidence locker. Subscribe if you can handle dark cases that don't let you sleep. And comment right now, do you think medication can change someone into a killer? Or is that just an excuse? Welcome back. Because tonight's story is one of those cases that split a town down the middle and still makes detectives go quiet when you ask them about it. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't an internet myth. This is a real crime case about a Texas teenager who allegedly shot two of his closest friends, and later claimed the same sentence over and over again like it was the only thing he could cling to. I wasn't myself anymore. And the most terrifying part? The first 911 call didn't come from a neighbor. It didn't come from a passerby. It came from inside the house. The night it happened, the air in that quiet Texas neighborhood felt too clean, too normal. The kind of suburban calm that makes you forget how close danger can live. Streetlights stood still. Lawns were cut. Cars were parked neatly in driveways like nothing bad had ever happened in this zip code. But at 10:47 p.m., the dispatcher's screen lit up. A shaky voice. Not screaming, thurs. Controlled. Flat. Like someone trying to sound calm while drowning. "Ma'am," the voice said. "I think I hurt somebody." The dispatcher asked the obvious question. The question that turns a normal shift into a nightmare. "Who did you hurt?" The caller swallowed. "My friends." The dispatcher paused, and for a moment, even the background noise in the call sounded wrong. No party music. No chaos. No voices. Just silence. Then the caller said something that made the dispatcher sit up straight in her chair. "They're not moving." Police were dispatched immediately. Not one unit. Not two. A full emergency response. Because when a caller says friends and not moving, it could mean anything from a fight to a stabbing to a mass casualty scene. But what officers found when they pulled up wasn't what anyone expected. The front door was open. No forced entry. No broken glass. No signs of a struggle from the outside. Just a warm porch light spilling into the night like the house was still trying to pretend it was safe. Officer Daniel Ruiz, one of the first on scene, later described it as the most unnatural quiet he'd ever heard. No dogs barking. No yelling. No running footsteps. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of tires on a highway. He approached the doorway with his flashlight up, weapon drawn, heart pounding hard enough to shake the beam. "Police," he called. Nothing. He stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Not the kind you expect in a home. Not food. Not detergent. A sharp metallic smell that didn't belong in a living room. And then the beam of the flashlight landed on the first body. A teenage boy. Face down. Motionless. And a few feet away, another. The scene turned the house into a crime lab instantly. More officers flooded in. Paramedics rushed, then stopped. Because there was nothing to rush toward anymore. The victims were both 17. Both local. Both known. And that made it worse. This wasn't some random home invasion. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. It had to be. Because the third teenager was still inside the house. Sitting at the kitchen table. Waiting. Hands visible. No weapon in his hands. Just a pale face, hollow eyes, and a stare that didn't match the horror around him. He looked like someone who had walked out of his own life and didn't know how to walk back in. Officer Ruiz ordered him to the ground. The teen complied immediately. No resistance. No anger. No fight. As cuffs clicked around his wrists, the teenager whispered something so quiet the officer almost didn't hear it. "I didn't want to do it." Ruiz leaned closer. "What did you say?" The teen's lips trembled. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to." His name, at least in the first wave of reporting, was everywhere. A 17-year-old high school student from Texas. No gang ties. No violent record. No history of arrests. To neighbors, he was just another kid. Quiet. A little awkward. Not the type to start fights. To teachers, he was average. Not a troublemaker. To his parents, he was their son. But to the detectives standing in that living room, staring at two dead teenagers, he was suddenly something else. A suspect. A killer. And nobody could understand why. Because nothing about the house suggested a chaotic fight. No overturned furniture. No blood trail leading down the hall. No broken picture frames. It looked like the victims had been caught off guard. Like they never even saw it coming. Which meant the shooter was close enough to them, emotionally and physically, that they felt safe right up until the moment they weren't. At the station, the interrogation room light was harsh and unforgiving. The teens sat across from two detectives. One older, one younger. A classic good cop bad cop setup, except neither of them wanted to play games. Not with this. Not with two dead kids and a suspect who looked like he could collapse at any second. The older detective leaned forward. "Tell me what happened tonight." The teens stared at the table for a long time, like the wood grain had answers written in it. Then he finally spoke. His voice was thin. "I don't know." The younger detective frowned. "You don't know? You called 911. "I know I called," the teen said. "I know they're gone." He swallowed hard. "But it feels like I'm remembering a movie I didn't watch." The older detective didn't blink. "Did you shoot them?" The teen's eyes filled with tears, but his face didn't move much. Like his emotions were trapped behind glass. "Yes," he whispered. The younger detective exhaled sharply, frustrated. "Then why?" The teen's hands shook in his cuffs. And that's when he said the sentence that would turn this case into a national controversy. "I started taking Accutane." The room went still. The older detective tilted his head slightly. "The acne medication?" The teen nodded, staring at his own wrists. "I started taking it a few months ago. I changed." The younger detective leaned in. "Changed how?" The teen's breathing quickened. "Angry. Empty. Like I was watching myself from the outside." He looked up. "And then I started thinking things I never thought before." The older detective's voice stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened. "Like what?" The teen hesitated. Then he said something that made both detectives exchange a look. "I started thinking about hurting people." Detectives didn't take that as a clean explanation. They took it as a possible excuse. Because every killer has a reason ready when the handcuffs go on. But here's the problem. This kid wasn't bragging. He wasn't proud. He wasn't defiant. He looked terrified of himself. And as investigators dug into his life, they found something that made the case even more disturbing. Text messages. Not threats. Not confession messages. But something worse. Messages to friends where he'd been hinting that something was wrong. One message, sent weeks before the shooting, read, "I don't feel like me anymore." Another said, "Sometimes I get these thoughts and I don't know where they come from." And the final one, the one that made detectives go cold, was sent only 3 days before the murders. It was just 7 words. "If I snap, please don't hate me." The police had a suspect in custody. They had a confession. They had a timeline. But they didn't have the one thing the public demanded. A motive that made sense. Because the victims weren't bullies. They weren't enemies. They were his friends. And the town couldn't stop asking the same question. How does a normal teenager go from acne medication to a double homicide? But the real nightmare didn't start with the confession. It started when detectives pulled the teen's medical records. Because buried in the paperwork was a note from his doctor. A note written weeks before the shooting that said the teen had reported violent, intrusive thoughts. And the medication had not been stopped. And when detectives realized that, one of them said something that would become the darkest line in the entire case. If that's true, then this wasn't just a crime. He looked down at the file. It was a warning nobody listened to. And then the lab called. They'd finished processing the weapon. And what they found on it made the entire case turn in a direction nobody expected. Because the gun didn't belong to the teenager. It belonged to someone else. Someone much closer to the victims than anyone realized. The excuse that wouldn't die. Before we go any deeper, pause for 1 second. If you believe this was cold-blooded murder, hit like right now. If you think something else was at play, comment, "Not that simple." And if you want real crime stories that don't hand you easy answers, subscribe, because this case only gets darker from here. The gun didn't belong to him. That single fact cracked the case wide open. When detectives traced the serial number, It didn't lead back to the teenager in handcuffs. It didn't belong to his parents. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't trafficked. It was legally owned by one of the victim's families. And suddenly, the story everyone thought they understood began to rot from the inside. Because now investigators had to ask a question that made them deeply uncomfortable. If this teenager didn't bring the weapon into the house, then who put it there? Detectives reconstructed the hours before the shooting minute by minute. The three teens had known each other for years. Same schools. Same neighborhood. Same routines. This wasn't a random hangout. It was normal. Boring even. Video games. Energy drinks. Music playing low enough not to wake the parents upstairs. According to phone data, nothing unusual happened for hours. No threatening texts. No escalating arguments. No final goodbye messages. Just normal teenage noise. And then, something changed. At 9:58 p.m., one of the victims' phones stopped moving. At 10:02 p.m., the second phone did the same. And at 10:47 p.m., the 911 call came in. That gap, those 49 minutes, became the most important unanswered window in the entire case. What happened in that house after everything went quiet? During the second interrogation, detectives stopped asking what happened. They focused on how. "How did you get the gun?" the older detective asked. The teenager rubbed his face with cuffed hands, exhausted, eyes bloodshot. "It was already there." "Where?" "In the house." "Where in the house?" The teen hesitated. "Bedroom closet." The younger detective leaned forward. "Whose bedroom?" The teen swallowed. It was his house. One of the victims. That detail mattered, because when police searched the closet, they didn't just find an empty space where a gun should have been. They found something else. A locked metal case. Inside it, prescription paperwork. Not for the shooter. For one of the victims. Antidepressants. Anti-anxiety medication. And notes from therapy sessions that mentioned fear, paranoia, and concerns about a friend's behavior. That friend? The same teenager now sitting in custody. At this point in the investigation, two narratives collided head-on. One side believed the shooter's claim, that medication changed him, hollowed him out, made him violent. The other side believed something far more disturbing, that the victims knew something was wrong and tried to protect themselves. So here's a question you should be asking right now, and I want you to answer it in the comments. If someone fears their friend might snap, does that make what happens next inevitable? Because according to digital forensics, one of the victims had searched something chilling just days before the shooting. The phrase was simple. "Signs someone might hurt you." And when detectives pulled browser history from the shooter's phone, they found something that shattered the idea that this all came out of nowhere. Repeated searches for, "Why do I feel angry all the time? Can medication change your personality? Am I dangerous?" That didn't look like a criminal planning a murder. It looked like someone afraid of himself. And that terrified investigators. This is where the Accutane controversy exploded. National media grabbed the headline and ran with it. Acne drug linked to double shooting. Doctors pushed back immediately. Mental health experts argued that correlation wasn't causation. Lawyers saw an opportunity. And the internet did what it always does, picked sides. So let me stop here and say this clearly. If you think blaming medication is a cop-out, comment, excuse. If you think ignoring mental health warnings is the real crime, comment, failure. Because the courtroom battle that followed would hinge on one brutal question. Was this teenager a monster? Or was he a system failure? Prosecutors didn't hesitate. They painted a picture of premeditation. They argued the shooter knew exactly where the gun was stored. That he waited until the house was quiet. That he didn't seek help when thoughts turned violent. And most importantly, they argued this. Millions of people take the same medication. They don't kill their friends. That argument resonated with jurors. But the defense had a weapon of their own. Medical records. Emails. Doctors' notes. One note stood out above all others. Written weeks before the shooting. Patient reports intrusive thoughts involving harm to others. Monitoring advised. Monitoring. Not stopping. Not urgent intervention. Just monitoring. And when the defense read that out loud in court, the room went silent. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about a teenager. It was about adults who saw warning signs and did nothing. The victims' families rejected that narrative completely. To them, this wasn't a tragedy caused by oversight. It was murder. They pointed to the 49-minute gap. They asked why the shooter didn't leave the house. Why he didn't call for help sooner. Why he stayed. Why he waited. Those questions didn't have clean answers. And that ambiguity became poison. Because the jury didn't need certainty. They needed belief. Then something unexpected happened. During trial prep, investigators uncovered a piece of evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. A voice memo. Recorded on the shooter's phone. Time-stamped 2 hours before the murders. The teenager's voice sounded shaky, almost panicked. "I don't feel right," he said. "I feel like something bad is going to happen. I don't trust my thoughts anymore." Then a pause. And the final line. "If anyone hears this later, I tried." That recording split public opinion straight down the middle. Some heard remorse. Others heard manipulation. And right now, I want to know which one you hear. Drop it in the comments, because this debate still hasn't ended. But before the jury could reach a verdict, before the town could begin to heal, the case took another turn. Because while the shooter sat in jail awaiting trial, another teenager from the same school was hospitalized. Same medication. Same intrusive thoughts. Same warnings. And when detectives heard that, they realized this wasn't just about one crime anymore. It was about a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. And buried deep in the pharmaceutical records was something even more disturbing. A clinical study, never shown to the jury, that raised questions about behavioral side effects in adolescents. And once that document surfaced, the prosecution panicked. Because if it became public, this case wouldn't just decide one teenager's fate. It could expose a system that failed multiple kids before the bodies ever hit the floor. And that's when the judge made a decision that shocked everyone in the courtroom. A decision that would determine whether the truth came out or stayed buried forever. If this case is already messing with your head, subscribe now, because this is where everything collides. They thought they were judging a teenager. They didn't realize they were putting an entire system on trial. And when the verdict finally came down, no one walked away feeling like justice won. The trial that broke everyone. Before we get into the courtroom, hit like if you want more true crime stories that don't just entertain you, they mess with your head. Subscribe right now, because the ending of this case is one of the most controversial outcomes I've ever covered. And comment this for me. Do you think this teen was a victim of his own mind, or a killer looking for an excuse? Because by the end of this chapter, you're going to be forced to pick a side. The courthouse in Texas didn't look special from the outside. Beige stone. Tall windows. An American flag snapping in the wind like it was trying to warn people away. But inside, the atmosphere was so heavy it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. On the first day of hearings, the hallway was packed. Reporters, true crime bloggers, local residents, and families who looked like they hadn't slept since the night everything happened. The two victims' parents sat on one side of the courtroom. The suspect's parents sat on the other. And between them was an empty space so wide it might as well have been a canyon. Nobody crossed it. Nobody looked across it. Because when your child is dead, and someone else's child is accused of killing them, there is no middle ground. The judge entered. The room rose. And the case that had started as a late-night 911 call became something far worse. A public dissection. Of grief. Of responsibility. Of mental health. And of a medication that millions of teenagers had taken without ever imagining it could be dragged into a murder trial. The prosecution came out swinging. They didn't want nuance. They didn't want maybe. They didn't want a debate about side effects. They wanted a clear narrative, because clear narratives win juries. Their argument was simple. The teen knew what he was doing. He had access to a gun. He pulled the trigger. He confessed. And now he was trying to hide behind a pill bottle. They described the victims as trusted friends who were ambushed in a place they believed was safe. And then the prosecutor turned to the jury and said something that made the entire room feel colder. This was not a medical tragedy. This was a choice. The defense didn't argue that the shooting didn't happen. They couldn't. The confession existed. The evidence existed. The timeline existed. Instead, they argued something more complicated. Something that made people uncomfortable. They argued that the teen's brain had been altered. That he had shown warning signs. That he had asked for help. That he had told adults something was wrong. And that he had been ignored. They brought up medical notes. They brought up the reported intrusive thoughts. They brought up the dosage increases. They brought up the second medication in his system. And then they asked the question that would become the core of the entire trial. If someone warns you they are losing control, and you do nothing, who is responsible when the control is finally lost? Now pause right here and comment, because I want to see what kind of audience you are. If a teen tells a doctor, "I'm thinking about hurting people," should that doctor be required to take action immediately? Type, "Yes, required," or, "Oh, not always." Because that exact question became one of the most explosive parts of this case. The prosecution called the first major witness, Detective Harlan. He walked to the stand with the slow, tired posture of a man who had seen too much. He described the crime scene in detail. The open door. The still bodies. The suspect sitting at the table. He described how calm the teenager had been. Not hysterical. Not panicked. Not frantic. And the prosecution leaned on that. They wanted the jury to see the calm as coldness. As guilt. As a lack of remorse. Then they played part of the interrogation audio. The teenager's voice filled the courtroom, thin and shaky. "Yes," he said. "I did it." The victims' families began to cry. One mother covered her face and rocked back and forth. And for a moment, even people in the audience who came for the story looked like they regretted being there. Because real true crime doesn't feel like content. It feels like damage. The defense cross-examined Harlan. And this is where the case turned. Because the defense asked one question that hit like a hammer. "Detective, did the weapon belong to the defendant?" Harlan paused. "No." "Who did it belong to?" Harlan swallowed. "It belonged to an adult." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense let it hang in the air, then asked the next question. "And was it stored in a locked safe?" "No." "And was it secured?" "No." The defense turned toward the jury. So the defendant, still legally a child, had access to a loaded firearm that was not secured by the adult who owned it. The prosecutor objected. The judge allowed it. Because it wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. And facts are lethal in court. Then came the medical testimony. And this was where the courtroom became a war zone. The defense called a psychiatrist who had evaluated the teen. The doctor described the teenager's symptoms: depression, emotional numbness, intrusive thoughts, dissociation. The doctor explained how some medications can trigger severe psychological reactions in rare cases, especially in adolescence. Then he said something that made the room go silent. The defendant described feeling detached from his actions. Like he was watching himself. The prosecutor jumped up. "Objection. Speculation." The judge overruled. The psychiatrist continued. "In my professional opinion, the defendant was experiencing a severe mental health crisis at the time of the offense." The prosecution wasn't having it. They brought their own expert. A cold, sharp witness who spoke like a textbook. He argued that correlation wasn't causation. That millions of teens take Accutane. That violent crime is extremely rare. That blaming medication could become a dangerous precedent. And then he said a sentence that lit the courtroom on fire. "People commit violence for reasons. They don't commit violence because of acne treatment." The victims' families nodded. The suspect's mother began to sob. "Here's your second CTA, and I want you to take it seriously. If you're watching this and you want more real cases told like a documentary, cases that force you to think, subscribe now. Because I don't just cover crimes. I cover the uncomfortable truth behind them. And this story is about to reach the part where everyone loses." The teen himself finally took the stand. And when he walked in, the room changed. He looked smaller than people expected. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a kid who had aged 20 years in a few months. He sat down, raised his hand, swore to tell the truth. And for the first time, the jury got to see him speak without police pressure. The defense asked him about his life before the medication. He described normal teenage stuff. Friends, embarrassment about acne. The feeling of being self-conscious every time someone looked at him. Then the defense asked him when things started to change. He described the first week. Mood swings. Anger. A strange emptiness. Then the nightmares. Then the intrusive thoughts. He said he didn't tell anyone at first because he was ashamed, because he thought it meant he was a bad person. But then he said something that made the jury lean in. "I told my doctor," he whispered, "and they told me it would pass." The prosecutor stood for cross-examination. He approached the teen like a predator. "You knew what you were doing when you called 911, correct?" "Yes." "You knew you shot them, correct?" "Yes." "You knew they were dead, correct?" "Yes." "So you knew right from wrong." The teen's face tightened. "I knew after," he said. The prosecutor's voice rose. "You knew before you pulled the trigger." The teen stared at the floor. And then he said the line that would become the most debated sentence in the entire case. "I didn't feel human anymore." Now comment this, because this is the third big debate. Do you think "I didn't feel human" is a real mental health warning or manipulation? Type warning or manipulation. I want to see how you think. The victims' families gave impact statements. And this is the part of the case that made even hardened reporters cry. One father described his son's laugh. One mother described the last text she ever received. One sibling described how the house felt empty now, like the air itself was missing someone. And then one of the mothers turned toward the teen and said something that made the courtroom go silent. "You didn't just kill my son. You killed who I was before I buried him." No one breathed. Even the judge looked down. Then came the verdict. And no matter what you believe, this is where the story becomes haunting. Because the jury didn't fully buy either side. They didn't accept the medication as a complete explanation. But they also didn't see the teen as a pure monster. They returned with a verdict that satisfied nobody. Guilty, but with considerations for mental health. Meaning the teen would be sentenced, but not in the way the victims' families wanted. Not the maximum. Not life without parole. Something less. Something that, to the public, looked like mercy. To the victims' families, looked like betrayal. To the teen's family, looked like survival. And to the internet? It looked like a war. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters shoved microphones forward. People screamed. One side yelled that the system had gone soft. The other side yelled that the system had ignored mental illness. And right there, in the chaos, one of the victim's relatives shouted a sentence that made headlines everywhere. "Stop blaming the drug. Blame the killer." But then, hours later, the defense released something that changed the conversation again. A sealed medical note. A note that hadn't been read aloud in court. A note written by a doctor weeks before the murders. And that note included a line that made the case even more disturbing. Patient requests to discontinue medication due to violent thoughts. Requests to discontinue, meaning he tried to stop. Meaning he may have been asking for help. Meaning he may have been trapped in a system that didn't respond fast enough. And then the final twist arrived. Not from the courtroom. Not from the jury. Not from the defense. But from the manufacturer's own history. Because as reporters dug into the medication, they uncovered something chilling. This drug had been linked to severe psychiatric side effects for years. Warnings had existed. Debates had existed. Lawsuits had existed. But millions of teens still took it. And most were fine. Which is what made the rare cases so terrifying. Because it meant the danger wasn't obvious. It wasn't predictable. It wasn't loud. It was silent. Until it wasn't. The teen was sent away. The victims were buried. The town moved on the way towns always do, pretending to heal while carrying scars underneath. But the families didn't move on. They couldn't. Because the question that haunted them wasn't just why. It was, when? When did this become unstoppable? When did the warning signs stop being warnings and start being destiny? And who could have stopped it? A parent with a gun safe? A doctor who took the complaint seriously? A school counselor? A friend who told an adult? Or the teen himself? If this story shook you, subscribe, because the next case I'm covering makes this one look tame. And if you think you already know how it ends, trust me, you don't. Also, hit like if you want me to keep bringing real cases like this with full documentary storytelling. And comment your final verdict. Was this tragedy caused by the medication, the gun, or the person? Type one word, medication, gun, or person. Because the truth is, this case didn't just destroy 3 families. It exposed how fragile the line is between a normal life and a moment you can never undo. And the scariest part? Somewhere in America tonight, another teenager is looking in the mirror, staring at their skin, feeling ashamed, and reaching for the same prescription bottle without knowing whether it will change their face or change their mind. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because the darkest cases are the ones that feel real. And this one is